Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox, and I would like to welcome you to a special 5-part podcast series sponsored by StoneTurn. A word about StoneTurn. Who do you turn to when you need assistance navigating the emerging risks around the pandemic, or help enhancing your compliance program? Who do you turn to for on-demand compliance resources and expertise? Turn to us, StoneTurn. Since 2004, council, corporations, and government agencies have turned to the global advisory firm StoneTurn when facing their greatest challenges. Make StoneTurn the place you turn for advice on regulatory, risk, and compliance issues, investigations, and business disputes. In this 5-part podcast series to celebrate Corporate Compliance and Ethics Week, we will consider each of the 6 elements required for an effective compliance program as laid out in StoneTurn's 6 elements of an effective compliance program. These 6 elements are risk assessment, governance and structure, policies, procedures, and controls, training and education, oversight and reporting, and response and enhancement. Over this 5-part podcast series, I will be joined by Stephen Martin and Valerie Charles, partners at StoneTurn, and Toby Ralston and Jamin Tyler, managing directors at StoneTurn. In this episode 3, I visit with Toby Ralston on controls, policies, and procedures as the backbone of your compliance program. Hello, everyone. Tom Fox back for another episode. Today I have with me Toby Ralston, managing director at StoneTurn, and we're going to take up the topic of policies, controls, and procedures. And although many people don't think of these as anything other than geek topics, Toby and I feel very differently about this. So Toby, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me.
Well, thanks for having me back, Tom, and I'm happy to geek out on this stuff.
So Toby, let me just start off by asking you, why do you see the code of conduct as a foundational component of any compliance program?
Sure. It is foundational. For most organizations, the code is kind of the baseline. The code's different from other organizational guidance in a number of ways, but as you and I have discussed on previous podcasts, Tom, in our view, the code should be more of principles-based than rules-based. I think what we find is effective codes are ones that set expectations of the behavior you want your employees and your stakeholders to abide by. It's sort of the collective moral compass, if you will. It's not a running list of the rules that you expect them to comply with.
Toby, how does the policies tie into the code? Do they explain what's in a principles-based code? Do they help give expansive definitions? I think we're probably far enough away from written by lawyers for lawyers. How do you help a client think through what should go into a policy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. I think where the code and then the deeper policy is somewhat of a pivot point. I'm somewhat reluctant to make an iceberg analogy here, but I think it's somewhat appropriate. Your code's often what's visible. It may be publicly available on your website, but your underlying policies are the roadmap. It's to how you conduct your business. Your policy library provides the operational direction that ensures consistency and integrity to your everyday business processes. Although, Tom, I'm now realizing the iceberg analogy is probably a terrible one. Your policies have to be readily accessible to everyone in your organization, so you shouldn't need a snorkel to find them.
Well, let's talk about that as accessibility, because the Department of Justice has, as far back as 2012, made that absolutely clear. They've talked about translations. They've talked about how it should be written in plain English. They've talked about presenting it in a way that's not simply a Word document or a PDF. So I was wondering if you might get your thoughts on really accessibility and how you can, you as the compliance practitioner, can help make the code easier and policies as well, easier for an employee who's trying to do the right thing to access and understand.
Yeah, this is actually a really timely discussion point. We're seeing a shift in demand in the marketplace in this regard. For what felt like decades, organizations took a boil the ocean approach to their codes. They were written really with regulators in mind. And I don't mean to suggest that the world reverts back to the wild, wild west with their codes. But what we are seeing is a shift towards back and towards an employee-focused codes that aren't 100 pages long. And an employee-centric code is one that embraces your organizational values, and it creates a sense of belonging for the reader. Now, as you and I just touched on, you'll still need your code to refer to your deeper policy guidance, and you'll need to be crystal clear on where that information exists, but it doesn't all need to be jammed into the code. And secondarily, Tom, I think your question around translation and attestation are good ones. I'll address the translation issue. I think you're doing you and your organization a tremendous favor by making your code available in as many languages as is sensible. Doing so, I think, demonstrates your commitment to your employees. The one drawback that I would highlight for any listener is, translation. Providing translations is important, but be very careful to select proper translation providers. Unfortunately, we've seen this go the wrong way. You don't want your policy to be misinterpreted because of a bad translation.
Let me change the focus just a little bit to internal controls. I have called internal controls the backbone of your compliance program. I'm not sure how you might feel about that, but could I start off by asking you, how should your internal controls be tied to your risk assessment?
Absolutely, and I wouldn't disagree with your summarization as the backbone. I would tend to agree. And I think most listeners on this podcast will be familiar with the notion that internal controls are used to mitigate risk. If your internal controls are poorly designed or they're not operating effectively, your organization is going to be left with too much residual risk. And oftentimes that comes at the cost of a tremendous amount of energy, dollars, and other resources being spent dealing with the fallout of not having the properly aligned internal controls. So I think fundamentally I would argue that if your legal and compliance team doesn't have a seat at the table when it comes to the periodic assessment of enterprise risk, you're behind the curve here. It's time to get involved, and it's time to reassess what internal controls you have in place.
You really said, I think, a couple of very interesting things. First of all was residual risk. The second was that your controls will be misaligned. But the third I found actually perhaps the most intriguing, which is the entire efficient system will be inefficient. And that people, I think, worry about, or they don't understand that you can make your controls more efficient if you perform a gap analysis, if you tie it to your risk assessment and really look at your risks and the risks that you have to manage. Is that a message that you find resonates with your client base?
Absolutely. I think aligning these processes so that you are, I almost can make it analogous to I don't know why, but I'm picturing a ropes course and having the nets in the right place. The internal controls, if mapped correctly, Tom, will really save yourself a lot of headaches. And frankly, it's one of those, that approach in terms of evaluating how the coverage works from your internal controls, that enables you to dive into what the DOJ is getting at, which is continuous improvement and monitoring.
Toby, as you know, I'm a lawyer. Many chief compliance officers have a legal training background or legal profession background. Many compliance professionals have a legal background, and they tend to see internal controls, or at least they think of internal controls as financial controls. But I have learned, I should say, that's a very short-sighted approach. And so I was wondering if you might discuss some instances of non-financial compliance internal controls and their importance.
Sure. No, and not unlike you, by having a CPA, by being a CPA by background, I certainly was sort of in the same camp. Financial controls used to be the end all be all, but in working through some corporate monitorships, and as well as working to help enhance compliance programs, we found that non-financial controls are often in place to mitigate those operational and reputational risks. In fact, your organization likely has procedures in place, and you may not have thought about them as serving as an internal control. One area where we've seen a heightened concern about the existence of, or in many cases the lack thereof, of non-financial controls is in the supply chain. Has your organization considered the depth and availability of backup vendors should a preferred or major supplier be impacted by the pandemic? Do you have those processes in place, those internal controls that are going to help you align a backup vendor? One might argue that a non-financial control are somewhat leading business indicators, whereas the detection of a poorly operating financial control may come way too late in the game.
One of my favorite stories of a non-financial internal control is there's actually an FCPA enforcement action where the SEC held board of director oversight was internal control. It also held that your code of conduct was an internal control. And frankly, I had not thought of those two as internal controls. So the lesson I learned from that case, Toby, was that really when it comes to internal controls, we're almost only limited by our imagination. If we have a way to process something, put a second set of eyes on something, that have an appropriate level of oversight and review, there can be override, once again, with an appropriate level of review, that can be an internal control. And that's really the message that I try to communicate to compliance practitioners as well.
Totally agree, Tom. Document. The notion of really any processes that you have at your organization that can be woven into your overall compliance program will only serve to benefit future improvements and compliance as a whole.
Toby, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I was wondering if any of our listeners wanted more information on any of the topics you brought up today, where could they go?
Yeah, as always, you can find us at stoneturn.com, and then I myself am always available. You can find me on LinkedIn.
Well, Toby, this has been a great exploration of policies, controls, and procedures. I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks as always, Tom.
This is Tom Fox again. If you'd like more information on StoneTurn, check out their website, www.stoneturn.com. I've also linked to it in the show notes. I hope you will join us again for another episode in our 5-part series on the 6 elements of an effective compliance program. I know you will find it useful. This special podcast series, sponsored by StoneTurn, is a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network.